There is probably no one cause of the Mexican-American War. War probably became inevitable when Texas won its independence from Mexico, an independence that, while granted by Mexico, was never fully accepted. When the United States agreed to annex Texas, the Mexican warned that this would mean war. The United States tried to resolve differences with Mexico by sending John Slidell to negotiate outstanding differences. He offered to forgive any claims against Mexico if Mexico would agree on the Rio Grande as the border with Mexico. He was further authorized to offer to purchase New Mexico, Northern and Southern California, from Mexico. California at the time was loosely held by Mexico and New Mexico, and was almost entirely unsettled. The Mexican government refused to meet with Slidell. They were not concerned about war with the United States, convinced that their army was stronger than the U.S. Army. When word of the Mexican government's action became known in Washington, Polk ordered an American force under General Taylor to advance his forces to Rio Grande River. The Mexicans demanded that the Americans withdraw. The Mexican general was ordered to attack, and on April 24, 1846, General Torrejon crossed the Rio with 16,000 cavalry. A group of 60 American troops, under the command of Captain William Thornton, was surrounded and captured. The war with Mexico was on. After the initial skirmish between American and Mexican forces, Taylor moved most of his forces back to Point Isabel, his supply base, while leaving his most forward position, Fort Taylor, to be defended by 500 men. The Mexicans began an artillery barrage against Fort Texas, which was located opposite Matamoros on the Rio Grande. From Point Isabel, the American forces could hear the cannon attack on Fort Texas, and concern mounted as to the fate of her defenders. Samuel Walker, a Texas Ranger, led 4 others through Mexican lines. He then snuck into the fort. There he determined that the Mexican assault had not harmed anyone. Walker successfully returned to American lines and reported. On the 7th, replacement forces arrived at Point Isabel to defend the base, freeing Taylor to move out and relieve Fort Texas. The first afternoon, the men moved out. They covered 5 miles that day and then camped out for the night. The Mexican army, under General Arista, decided to make their stand on a grassy plain spotted with ponds. Arista had 5,000 men, Taylor 3,000. Taylor allowed his men a last drink and headed toward the Mexican lines at 2:30 p.m. The Mexicans opened fire first, but as the Americans were out of range, the cannonballs fell harmlessly. Taylor then brought forth his artillery, and it became an artillery duel between the two forces. The American artillery was accurate and had a devastating effect on the Mexican forces. The Mexicans tried a flanking attack on Americans' position. The attack was successfully repulsed. The fighting continued until dusk, with both sides sustaining casualties. At dawn, the Mexican forces withdrew towards Matamoros and Fort Texas. Taylor's forces followed and found the Mexican forces dug in along an old bed of the Rio Grande called Resaca de la Palma. This was an excellent defensive position, and the Mexicans were dug in well. The American forces tried to dislodge the Mexicans with an artillery attack, but in that the American forces were not successful. A number of assaults took place against the Mexican lines. At first they were not successful. However, American forces fought desperately, until finally forces under Captain Smith managed to capture a key Mexican cannon position. Then American forces managed to outflank Mexican forces on the right flank. By 5 o'clock, Mexican lines broke and their soldiers fled across the Rio Grande.